This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. You know, we've been around for a long time now, and we've had many different lineups, and Heretic Happy Hour is only getting bigger and better, with guest hosts like Rainn Wilson, David Bentley Hart, John Fugelsang, Candida Moss, Elaine Pagels, and of course, December Rose. 2024 and 2025 are turning out to be our best years yet. So check us out on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's Heretic Happy Hour. We hope to see you soon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat. I'm with my brother, John, and our newest, bestest friend, Bethany. Say hi, John and Bethany. At the same time, go.
Hi, John.
What's up?
Ah, man. You almost did it.
Almost.
I know I threw you for a loop, but this is the podcast that we call This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you would have left by now and you'd be in the parking lot. Like we said earlier, maybe smoking a cigarette and drinking a Coors Light. Not that Bud Light though, because that's for them woke people.
Yeah,
and, we wouldn't want to be. Sorry, that's a joke that our guest is probably, thankfully, gratefully, probably unfamiliar with. So, I wouldn't wish that familiarity on you. So anyway, hey, before I say anything else silly, it's late here. This is one of these awesome situations where we're interviewing somebody who was in Sweden. So we stayed up late and he got up early. And so it's kind of, whenever you listen to this, it's fine, but we're recording this and it's 11 o'clock in Texas at night. It's 6 a.m. in Stockholm, and John and Bethany are on the West Coast where it's 9 o'clock. So it's a little bit strange, and it reminds us that we get to do awesome things because of technology. And could you imagine, 10 years ago, this probably wouldn't have even been possible.
No.
We'd have been on telephones, grappling about how much it costs to make long distance phone calls. My kids don't even know what a long distance phone call is. They have no concept that at one point, when John and I were kids, and this is completely off topic, it has nothing to do with nothing, but my grandmother, our paternal grandma and grandpa, lived 60 miles away, and it was a long distance call to call them. Remember that, John? And we'd be like, can we call grandma? I don't know. It's that's going to cost like 50 cents. Don't do that. So our kids are like, they could call anywhere in the world. Yeah, it's a world that they don't have any particular gratitude for, because they don't know what they're missing. But in some ways, they live in a better world. So, and I think one of the things that we'll talk about is one of the reasons I said is stuff that we'll talk about this evening. So let me introduce our guest, and we'll run off to an awesome conversation. Thomas Kazen is a professor and research chair of biblical studies at Stockholm School of Theology, University College in Stockholm. He's authored numerous books and articles in English and Swedish, including Moral Infringement and Repair in Antiquity, and Impurity and Purification in Early Judaism and the Jesus Tradition. And his current book that we're here to talk about is called Dirt, Shame, Status, Perspectives on Same-Sex Sexuality in the Bible and the Ancient World. And without any further ado, welcome to the podcast. How are you, Thomas?
Well, I'm fine, thank you. I just woke up this morning, and we're actually one day ahead of you right now.
Wow.
Well, the other thing that was interesting, and this is just more of a sort of a geography thing, is because of where you are in the world. It's been light out since 4 a.m. And you said the sun won't set until what, 11 or so? You said?
Yeah, something like that. And if we go further north in Scandinavia, well, the sun doesn't set at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a few weeks.
Yeah, I don't know, because that might be okay, but then the flip side of that is that later in at the other times of the year you get that same in reverse, don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
For a good chunk of time, it's like, I don't know. My wife and her family lived in Iceland for about 3 or 4 years when she was a kid, and she talks about that. Like at first it was novel, and then there were times when like, okay, this needs to stop. But
I mean, no, it's actually good. I like it.
Okay.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, the seasons are distinct.
Very distinct. Sure. That's a good perspective. I like that.
Well, I'm hopeful, and I'm anxious to hear. I think what are going to be some pretty unique perspectives. That's what I think this conversation promises us. So. Have you lived in Sweden your whole life? Are you born and raised there?
Yes. I have, except for 3 years in Sierra Leone in West Africa, because my parents were medical missionaries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I know. I'm a Swede. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just curious because we normally sort of ask our opening question for a lot of folks is just to talk about their spiritual background. And it sounds like you at least spent some of your adolescence or childhood in the mission field as medical missionaries. Was that also just for medical things, or was that also maybe a church-based mission that had
it was a church? I mean, lots of medical missions are usually church-based, right? But yeah. So I grew up in a church, and I consider myself liberal Christian. I guess you did. I grew up in a more conservative setting than I am now. Than is now my present context. But yeah.
Okay.
That's basically my background.
Gotcha. No, it sounds like a lot. John and I both grew up in pretty conservative churches, and then I don't know, as you do, I guess part of growing up is questioning the stuff you were raised on and asking questions and sort of pushing the boundaries a bit. And I also know that liberal, when we say liberal within a religious context, a lot of times it means something different than within, say, a political context, right? So in America, liberal has this whole set of baggage that comes with it. But I also know that there are, within theology, a liberal theologian. I mean, that my father-in-law accused me or got on my case because I was reading Karl Barth, and he is he's a liberal theologian, but he's actually, he's in that school, I would think, of liberal theologians. But so when you say, go ahead.
Well, these concepts, these terms, I mean, they are like rubber bands, right? So you can use them for all sorts of things, and even when you cross the Atlantic, liberal doesn't mean exactly the same thing on our side of the Atlantic as it does on yours. And of course, liberal theology is often associated with 19th century, certain types of 19th century positions or developments. That when I say that I'm a liberal Christian, I simply mean I'm not a conservative at all. Yeah, and you could call it ecumenical, or you could call it open to all sorts of views of life. It's non-dogmatic or whatever. But the religious landscape in our part of the world is pretty different from yours. I mean, you have an extremely strong evangelical tendency in North America, which is very peculiar from a European perspective. I would say many of the issues that are issues within Christianity in North America, they are not issues over here. They may not be completely unheard of, but many people would shake their heads at. I mean, many devout Christians would shake their heads at many of the issues and discussions going on in North America. That's for sure. Yes.
That makes sense.
I feel like that's one of the reasons why your book is you were able to write the book in the way that you write it. I don't think it would work here. The book, is very factual based. There's I remember thinking about halfway through it that I don't really. I mean, I'm used to reading books where I get someone's opinion throughout the book, and I don't feel like you're just kind of giving us facts as we go along, and I don't think that would work within the United States in the same way, because everyone would be like, well, what's your opinion? Why aren't you telling me what you think? Why aren't you giving me your side of it? And your book, I think, does a really good job of just kind of laying out the facts within this idea of the relationship of same-sex sexuality within the biblical context and outside the biblical context. I think you do a really good job with that.
Yeah, I think it does work, from my opinion, John. I think it almost, reading through this book, it allowed me to step away from somebody else's opinion. And I feel like we are bombarded by people's opinions in the United States all the time, especially if we're on social media. Everybody's just touting what they believe all the time. I do it too. I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else, but reading your book, Thomas, from the perspective of like, just such good content, like you did your homework, and I feel like you were just holding it out as an offering for the reader to then find their perspective in it. And at the end, you do offer your opinions, and you offer it in such a kind and compassionate way without trying to be forced or, trying to convince somebody of one way or another. But you almost lead up to it in a way that just allows the reader to receive differently. At least it did for me. I really, I don't know. I feel like I took a course in seminary in the last few days that I've been reading this, and I'm really grateful for that, because it's been a while since I graduated from seminary. So this is helpful.
Well, I mean, I just try to lay the facts on the table. And I think my own position is quite clear, both in the introduction and especially the concluding chapter. But that's a position I take based on the facts about biblical texts and the cultural contexts, the comparative material that I bring up, and of course, it is possible to take another position. There are always, 1,000 various positions you can take on an issue, but if you don't base them on the bare facts, but as you say, just have an opinion of something. Well, an uninformed opinion is nothing but a prejudice. Yeah, whether it's right or wrong, it's nothing but prejudice.
Right. No, I agree. And that's, for some reason, and maybe this might also delineate some differences in culture between what's happening in North America and the United States specifically now, and our sensibilities and attitudes towards issues like sexuality versus certain parts of Europe. I will hold England, probably the UK probably is probably closer to us than maybe the rest of mainland Europe. But it seems like, at least from this perspective, a good part of Europe has been more forward thinking in some of these areas as they've become a little bit more secularized. And we seem to be regressing back towards more fundamentalist and more extreme views of religion.
Well, mind you, there are these kind of regressive tendencies in Europe as well these days. Yeah. Unfortunately,
yeah. And I'll let you know ahead of time. I have not read your book because I didn't get it in the mail. So I wouldn't normally bring it up and admit that. It's not because I didn't want to, but I'm 100 miles away from home, and the book is probably on my desk. But if I say something silly, like ask you a question that's in the book, you won't know it because. So I just wanted to kind of like kick off by asking. I know that there's a lot of cultural, at least the studies that I've done on this topic, with same-sex relationships throughout the ancient world, in Judaism in particular. And then a lot of times where we get into trouble is we anachronistically read those passages of scripture through 21st century eyes, and we put them into our social and current, our context, and apply our sensibilities to them. So maybe you can start out by asking or by talking about those differences between how we read the scriptures, where they, there's not it's not like there's a ton of scriptures that speak to this issue.
In the very introduction of the book, I bring up the few texts that actually address this issue, and they are so few. They are really so few. Two very similar condemnations in the book of Leviticus, and then something that Paul says in the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, and there is another short passage in First Corinthians, and half of which is sort of mirrored or repeated in First Timothy, and that's just about it. And then we have lots of ideas, usually have lots of ideas about texts certain texts or certain narratives being about same-sex actions, or rather about homosexuality, as it is often phrased, like the story about Sodom. But that's not the issue. The issue is inhospitality in the Sodom narrative, and that is so clear when you look at in ancient interpretation and reception history. So it's except for Philo, in the Jewish philosopher contemporary with approximately contemporary with Paul. We have to go to 4th century Christian authors in order to find that an interpretation of the story of Sodom as a matter of sexual acts between as a matter of sexual acts between males, because in all other contexts, including a mention in the Jesus tradition in the Gospel, Sodom is taken as an example of hostility against strangers, xenophobia, and it's very difficult for us moderns to understand this, because we see the sexual acts, or they're not fulfilled, but the wish of the inhabitants of Sodom to have sex with these male strangers that visit the house of Lot. But this is a matter of power play, of asserting your superiority over against these strange peoples, and degrade them, humiliate them, and this is what is so difficult for us moderns to understand, because we think, or we've learned that proper sex is a matter of mutuality. It's a matter of consent. It's an, or at least it should be, right? And in Antiquity, if we simplify a bit, sex is an act by a superior over against an inferior person, whether a woman, a minor, a slave, or whatever. So sex is always conceptualized. Almost always conceptualized. I wouldn't say always, but almost always conceptualized. The default setting, so to speak, is hierarchical, and this is vital in our for us to be able to understand not only sex between people of the same gender, but in order to understand sexuality in general in Antiquity. Yeah.
Well, and we can tend to have again, as 21st century moderns, we have a fairly romanticized view of sexual relations, marriage, even, which didn't exist in the ancient world, right? The concept of marriage in the ancient Near East is worlds apart from how we conceptualize marriage today.
Well, it's a transaction. It's a transaction, but an economic transaction, family transaction, and of course that is not so foreign to the modern world as we might want to think. But you're right that we have this romanticized ideal, and of course that is not completely absent from the ancient world. You look at this book, Song of Songs, for example, in the Hebrew Bible. So and of course, in there are ancient Greek and Roman texts that where you find romance as well, romantic relationships, but still there, and that's maybe one of the things that has struck me when I've been involved in this kind of research, not only regarding same-sex relationships, but regarding all sorts of relationships in the ancient world, that hierarchy, extreme hierarchy, permeates just every relationship, and it is so taken for granted that it sometimes passes us by, don't realize it.
Yeah, and from your research, it just seems like it was so normalized in the ancient world as well, that the hierarchical system, when it came to taking ownership of somebody else's body, specifically young boys, prepubescent boys, it was such a normalized way of life back then. And I mean, obviously that's abhorrent. It's something that our world does not say yes to. And, that there's a huge punishment for that, of course. But the hierarchy still exists today. We see it everywhere, and it just doesn't always look like the same as it used to in that regard.
Ancient Greek pederasty is a very special phenomenon, and it's very difficult, I think, to understand from our perspective. So even the ancient Greeks, of course, made a difference between what they called hubris and pederasty. Pederasty was socially accepted in Athens and in many other places as well, but it was always regarded as very complicated, and it was a kind of it was a social convention, which of course is no defense, cannot be a defense from our perspective, but the perspectives were. Their perspective was so different and based on hierarchical relationships that we cannot really understand, I think, fully how they were thinking around these issues. But the hierarchical framework is, I think, very well captured in a short statement by Seneca the Elder, Roman author. In his controversies, he describes how a famous orator, Haterius, defended a freedman who was this freedman. A former slave had been declared free by his patron. He was accused of having acted as a passive partner to his patron, his former owner, and in this context, the orator Haterius is supposed to have said that shamelessness for a freeborn is a crime, for a slave a necessity, and for a freedman a duty. So here you've got you've got a spectrum, or a sort of levels in a hierarchy, right? You've got the slave at the bottom, who is slave at the bottom, who is simply bound to follow the wishes of his or her owner, and then you've got a freedman. A free male is not supposed to subordinate himself to another free male, and if he does, by being sexually penetrated, that's a shame, right? But for a freedman, and he's somewhere in between, standing in a relationship of dependency to his former owner, who is now his patron. And in order to understand this, we also need to realize that our concepts, of heterosexuality and homosexuality were not that clear in antiquity. But a free male who was on top of the ladder, so to speak, could exercise his sexuality towards other people who were subordinate to him in rank. Whether they were male or female wasn't the issue, really. As long as, of course, another woman who was not legally his own, if that woman was the wife of another freedman, to have a sexual relationship with such a woman would be considered to be a crime, not mainly against the woman, but mainly against the man who owned the sexual rights to that woman. Right? If that was a slave woman of another free person, that was less of a problem and could just be cleared by an agreement or by payment or something. All of these things are, at least on the surface, very foreign to us. The interesting thing is that if you scratch the surface of Western culture, you find that you've got much of this kind of thinking barely below the thin layer of varnish that we have painted our culture with. But then that is also, I think that's something that is by many people experienced as threatening. So we don't want to scratch that surface and see that, we can actually emotionally and conceptually connect to some of these phenomena that we see in antiquity, especially to the hierarchical structures and the hierarchical thinking. We've got it in our own cultures as well, although we don't affirm that usually we don't affirm that mindset, that attitude. Right?
Oh, we'd certainly never put it in those terms, right? We never say it that way. But you're right. No, we certainly wouldn't want to see that we have that much in common with people that we seem to kind of look at our nose at a little bit. But how much of this too has to do with, because you brought this up briefly about, so we have, obviously there's power dynamics at play, right? And there are these prohibitions in the Hebrew Bible that seem to be fairly strong, and specifically against male homosexuality. But how much of that has to do with the patriarchal nature of that culture within that within Judaism that like you mentioned would say the power would be shifted if you were to allow yourself to be treated that way as a man by another man. It's almost that's where that shame comes in, right? Yeah, I don't know if I'm reading into that or. Yeah,
this is not especially Jewish or something. I mean, this is in ancient Near Eastern culture, as we would perhaps prefer to say, ancient West Asian or Southwest Asian culture. Hierarchies, like all ancient cultures and many modern cultures, that it was an extremely hierarchical culture with honor and shame playing a big role. Status played a big role. If you look at ancient West Asian law collections like the Code of Hammurabi or other similar codes, the difference between free people and slaves is very clear, and status means a lot. So a free male, the status of a free male must not be compromised, and by anal penetration, the status of one male will compromise another male, right? And there is a very interesting, it's not a direct parallel, but from the Middle Assyrian law collection, which is it's like 11th century BC. You've got this, you find this law that states or tells how a person who penetrates another male is going to be punished. And I looked the text up here for you to see. Let's see if I can find it very quickly, because this is worth quoting. If a man secretly spreads rumors about his neighbor and says everyone fucks him, or in open quarrel tells him everyone fucks you, and further, I can prove, but cannot prove, and does not prove, then they shall give him 50 lashes. He shall serve the king for a whole month. They shall cut his hair. He shall also pay 3,600 shekels of lead. Now that's for spreading rumor, right? Now comes the next. If a man fucks his neighbor and they prove it, and of course the neighbor is a comrade, it's an equal free male, right? If a man fucks his neighbor and they prove it and find him guilty, they shall fuck him and castrate him. So the punishment is treating that man, degrading that man the same way as he degraded his companion who should be his equal, right? So when we look at the texts from Leviticus, there are two. With a male you must not lie. Woman lays, that's my translation. That is an abomination. That's from Leviticus 18. And in Leviticus 20, this is repeated, but with a variation. And a man who lies, a woman lays with a male, the two of them have done an abomination. They shall die indeed. Their blood is with them, or their blood guilt is with them. So it's like the difference here with the second version is that both males are actually considered liable, guilty. While in the Middle Assyrian law, it's the perpetrator who's being punished. Only the perpetrator being punished. But the issue is the same, that this is about one male penetrating another male. And when we talk of homosexuality, we're talking, that's homosexuality is a very modern term. It appeared in the 19th century, and these ideas about homosexuality and heterosexuality, very modern concepts. The ancients did not think in quite those terms, but here is a male sexuality is equal with penetration, right? And here we have the idea of one male penetrating another male who is thereby degraded because he should be at the same level. Now, if he penetrates a woman, she is not degraded in the same sense because she's already subordinate. Yeah. She is degraded if she belongs to another male owns her sexual rights, so to speak. And then the degradation is more against her male rather than against her. And to many of us, of course, this is awful. But when we talk about same-sex relationships today, we think about love, right? Mutual relationships, affirmative relationships that, just like heterosexual relationships, create community and stability and make us feel secure. That's something. We're not talking about the same thing here, and that's why these texts cannot be used in our modern discussion. It's so anachronistic, so completely anachronistic to use these texts as some kind of blueprint for how people should arrange their lives and relationships today.
And in a way, to hear you explain it, it sounds more like a property crime, like in some sense, like so if you have sex with your neighbor's wife, the offense is to her husband.
Yeah.
More so than to her, because I've degraded your property somewhat. But
that is true. That is true. It's not to a degree. It is true because we should also, at the same time, if we want to be fair to the ancients, we should not equate it completely with a property crime, but it has a certain similarity, because women were not regarded as completely as property in the ancient world. They also had their own agency, but less so than male agency. And we could perhaps say that their sexuality was owned by the superordinate male in question, whether it was a husband or a father, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or even in some cultures, a brother, right? Another male.
Yeah. In some, especially if an unmarried woman and whose father was no longer alive. Yes.
But what strikes me as particularly anachronistic, that is, in our current, in our current mode of thinking, homosexuality within the American church is a moral issue. We've made all these blanket, moral judgments about these things. And to me, it seems like even within Antiquity, it wasn't so much a moral issue as it was a power issue, as it was a stepping outside of the hierarchical structures. And so that word abomination, can you talk to that? Because the word abomination in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, seems to be applied to an awful lot of things. And yet we really like it when it talks about this issue, that we can say, well, that's an abomination. It says so in the Bible, but so is eating shellfish, and so is mixing fabrics, and so is cutting the hair inside of your head. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for us in terms we can understand what qualifies as an abomination? What do we from that?
Yeah, it's used it's the Hebrew term to'eva. It is used in different ways in different texts. Actually, in Deuteronomy, it's applied quite broadly to all sorts of things that are disagreeable. Very often to idolatry, the worship of wrong gods or wrong types of worship, but also to other things. And in Leviticus, in the second part of Leviticus, which we call the Holiness Code, which is later, Leviticus is actually later than Deuteronomy, although it comes before Deuteronomy in the canonical order, right? The storyline in these books is one thing. The question of when they were actually written and redacted and received their final form is quite different. So in the Holiness Code, the Holiness Code uses to'eva, abomination, quite a lot. The preceding purity and sacrificial laws do not. So there it is in the Holiness Code. It is used very much as a discussed term for behaviors that are considered impure. And I mean, this is a technique that we can see, a rhetorical technique we can see today as well. Things that you disapprove of, you often call disgusting, which doesn't mean that they evoke this kind of visceral, emotional disgust. There are lots of things we call disgusting without them being physically disgusting. But by using this kind of rhetoric, we sort of transfer a very visceral and emotional dislike or disapproval to these behaviors or phenomena. It's very dangerous, actually, to use disgust as a moral pointer, because we humans exploit disgust terminology in order to forward values that are often based on quite different things. Yeah.
No. Yeah. Totally agree. It's such a minefield, And I wonder then, and I don't mean, I'm going to turn this over to you guys in just a second, but as these thoughts are in my head, I wonder then, is it telling that in the say in the Gospels and in the New Testament, say the epistles of, it's Paul pretty much exclusively, whoever even broaches these subjects. You don't hear Jesus. Jesus doesn't bring this topic up at all, except maybe obliquely, when he talks about marriage between a man and a woman, which doesn't necessarily preclude anything else, but so Jesus doesn't really broach it. None of the other apostles do. Paul speaks to it And I wonder if that has anything to do with his upbringing as a Pharisee and his deep, his maybe his deeper understanding and knowledge of the law, that he would carry maybe a little bit of those sensibilities forward and bring them into the fledgling Christianity. Does that make sense, or am I reading too much into that?
Well, here's another minefield, I think, because, well, of course, for a Jew during the Second Temple period, with Leviticus in the background, this, of course, same-sex sexual acts would not be approved of, right?
Right.
Right. But in a Christian context, it has been far too common to blame some of these, what we today think are intolerant attitudes on Jewish culture of some kind. It's a lingering remains of anti-Jewish sentiments that make us think this way, because the condemnations we find both in Leviticus and Paul are at the core, or at the very bottom, based on the same type of hierarchical thinking that we find all over in the ancient world, and they're really no different. So I think we should be aware of thinking, in terms of, this is Old Testament law, and it's much
it's much wider
like
than that.
Yeah, that's the reason why these condemnations are so harsh, or something like that. No, we should be careful with that, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, based on what you're saying, Nat, and the question that you had, is the way that I see the scriptures, and even reading these harsher scriptures that we try to avoid in the church sometimes. I think a lot of it has to do, and even Paul's perspective, a lot of it has to do with idolatry. And if we are to be people of God, following the ways of God, God says first that you should have no other gods before me. And so much of sexual gratification in that time and in today is a form of idolatry, that we are so focused on being sexually gratified. And back then, it seems like a lot of this was based on not just hierarchy, but also what can I do? How can I do this to make sure that I am sexually gratified in it? And everything in scripture is so progressive for the time and place that it was written. It was like, I don't know, I just see it as Paul acknowledging the reality of power and control, and how gross it was, the taking advantage of subordinates in that way with the power that you have. And I don't know if it was like a blanket rule of, no, there's no same-sex erotic behavior that's ever allowed in any case from now until eternity. I think it was, from my perspective, it was more of Paul was moving people towards greater love for God and fidelity towards God within their sexuality, where we're not taking advantage of people who are more vulnerable in the world. That's just the way that I see it, but I could be wrong.
well, we could all be wrong. There is something in what you're saying. At the same time, we should also be aware of, kind of whitewashing Paul, or painting him into bright colors. He was a child of his time. Everyone is. There are aspects of mutuality in Paul's reasoning. For example, when you look at 1 Corinthians, he says the man should give his wife what he is obliged to, and vice versa. That's a very interesting passage, actually, and the closest we come to it in the ancient world is probably the also somewhat contemporaneous Roman Stoic, who wrote in Greek, Musonius Rufus, who also had ideas of mutuality between husband and wife. Although many regards he was very conservative, but when it came to to these points. He actually affirmed a sort of mutuality which wasn't too common in the ancient world. So he and Paul are interesting in that regard. And at the same time, when we look very closely at these texts, they are phrased in terms, and they still assume a very paternal and hierarchical society that we really cannot go with today. So we in Christian context, we very often want to make the biblical text applicable to our time, and that's part of our problem, because there is hardly a single text that you can just apply straight off, right? You have to go through this hermeneutical process, look at the text within its cultural context, and there are lots of good things you can bring out of biblical texts, but very rarely you can do it just straight off, take a text and just apply it. You're taking an enormous risk if you do that. You're granting the biblical text a type of normativity which assumes a timelessness that isn't possible within the world of human beings. Because human beings we're contextual, historical beings. We're firmly anchored in cultural and historical context. So this idea of normativity, of the textual normativity, is in many ways a curse, I would say, and it is simply not realistic unless you, of course, regard texts as provided by the divine power, Senkrecht von oben, as the Germans say, and completely acontextual, completely ahistorical, assuming that the Spirit of God kind of has imbued them with an authoritative message that goes straight to you, straight to your brain and understanding in whatever culture and historical context you live. Now, this is not the way humans are made. I'm sorry, but it's not the way we're made. It's an idea that if you scrutinize it, but it's completely way off, and this is not how people in the past have treated the Bible. This is not how the Bible has been received and interpreted through history. It has always been interpreted through the kind of methods and from the kind of perspectives that people have held in every single context and single time. And today we have access to historical methods. Today we have access to historical knowledge, which goes far beyond what people had in the past. And so we're bound to use that sort of knowledge in our interpretation and our readings. If we don't, we're kind of lost. This is our context, our segment of history, and we've got to live within it. Sorry, now I got off track a bit.
No,
but
I think
these are important hermeneutical points that actually underlie the kind of investigation I've tried to make.
Yeah, I think you're 100% on track though, because that if I had to point to a single problem within the modern American evangelical church, it's exactly what you just said, which is there's a certain segment of the religious culture here that does exactly what you just advised against doing. which
Right,
takes this.
right. Regarding the text and normative, and I would claim,
timeless.
and yeah, exactly, and I would claim that that's not the way religious texts work. They are formative. They can have a formative function, and it's a great difference. And even for hardcore fundamentalists, they don't take every text as normative. They actually use. They're actually not governed by the text, whatever they say. They're governed by their values, which they got in other ways, right? And through culture, through upbringing, through all sorts of influences, and use the text. They use the text to affirm their values, and when their values go in one direction and the text don't fit the values, they will explain the text, will be willing to explain the text based on contextual considerations. But on other issues, in other cases, they will refrain from doing that. So I think all interpreters are inconsistent in one way or another, but we need to become aware of our inconsistency. And that's why I believe in putting all the facts on the table, all the historical facts on the table, and see where do they point to, really.
Well, if you don't think fundamentalist Christians know how to nuance things, just ask them about the passages of Scripture where Jesus tells us to feed the poor, and to maybe tells the rich people to give away all their money, and suddenly you have nuance for days. You have well, you understand Jesus wasn't talking about all rich people at all times. He was all of a sudden now we have context. But so you're right. So anytime the text seems to line up exactly with what they go, well, I just read the text. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. Sorry, it's right there in plain English as it was written by Jesus and his followers. And if
the King James version was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me.
So, but you're right, and you're 100% right that we all come to any text. We come to anything with our own sensibilities, our own biases. Of course we do. That's why I always cringe when someone says, "Well, I just read the Bible." No, you don't. None of us do. We all have lenses we look through. Douglas Campbell, great Pauline scholar, told us that. He's like, everyone comes to these scriptures with their own lenses, and
we need to be self-critical, right?
Of course.
Because if we don't scrutinize our own arguments and our own presuppositions, then we're just living by prejudice. An opinion which is not actually being scrutinized and questioned, it's a prejudice. And if we want to run the world by prejudice, okay, we can do that, but it will be a pretty miserable world. Well, it is a pretty miserable world, actually.
I think that's how we got where we are. It's like, what did Dom Crossan tell us, John? He said, faith without reason is superstition. That was, and likewise, what you're saying, when we don't scrutinize these things, we get bias is all we get. So, and you said this in the very beginning, and I want to reiterate because I think you're 100% right. Even if you're right, if you've arrived there through sort of faulty logic, you still have a bias. Yeah, and you don't have a framework for why you think that way. So that's why I still have people that I talk to who I know they think the right things. I'm just not sure they know why they think those things, and they haven't thought through the processes of how they got there, so they can't very well defend them. And when the time comes to explain or get into it, maybe have a discussion with someone, they kind of crumble because that's just what I think. Well, it's better to have thought it through and at least have some reasons why you think what you think and have some facts. But I tell you what, this is a topic that is, I don't know, it's super important to us. It's one of those things that I see the church hopefully making some leaps forward in this area, and it will be because of the work of people like you who are actually doing the hard work and laying out some good arguments for us. I just appreciate it so much. So, John,
I was in agreement with you. Having a book like yours that gives us all this factual information gives me a basis for my decisions. The decisions that I make about what I believe when I come to these when it comes to these topics. And I think that's very important. And like Nat says, it's important to have something that you can use to defend where you stand, as opposed to just like when someone says, well, why do you believe that? And it's like, because I do. That there's just not a lot there. There's no substance there. So having a book like yours is very, very informative and very helpful.
Well, thank you. And I think I should point out that all these facts that I put on the table, they are not new, right? They've been there for long, and several people before me have written on these issues, etc. What I try to do, and hopefully is what I hope is somewhat new, is the way I organize this, the way I try to make these arguments accessible to people, and the perspective, the lenses through which I look at this topic. It's purity and impurity is one, and the other one is hierarchy and subordination, and the third one is honor shame, relationship between honor and shame. And I think that my idea has been that by using these three perspectives as interpretive lenses, I hopefully contribute to making things a bit clearer.
Well, once again, the book is called Dirt, Shame, Status, Perspectives on Same-Sex Sexuality in the Bible and the Ancient World. I believe it comes out early September. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what the Erdmans has told me. Yeah.
Highly encourage, if this is a topic, if you're for those of you who are listening, this is something that interests you, and I don't think you can do better than a book like this that's so thoroughly researched, so well put together. And if nothing else, it'll get you started on some of these conversations. So unless you guys have anything else, I think we should say our goodbyes and say thank you, Thomas. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.